There's a 34-year-old marketing manager named Claire who has never spent a single night alone in her entire adult life. Not one. She moved from her parents' house to a college dorm, from a dorm to a boyfriend's apartment, from that apartment to a marriage, and from that marriage into another relationship before the divorce papers were even finalized. Ask her why, and she won't say she's afraid. She'll say she just prefers company. But somewhere underneath that answer is a fear so old she can't even remember when it started. This is not a rare story. Millions of people move through life the same way, quietly terrified of empty rooms and silent evenings, and most of them don't even realize it's fear driving the wheel. They call it love. They call it being social. They call it just liking people. But psychologists who study attachment and loneliness see something different. They see a pattern. And once you learn to recognize it, you start seeing it everywhere, in coworkers, in friends, sometimes in the mirror. So what actually happens inside the mind of someone who cannot stand to be alone? It starts, most of the time, long before adulthood. Children develop what psychologists call an attachment style, based on how consistently their caregivers responded to their needs. A child whose parent was warm but unpredictable, sometimes present and loving, sometimes distracted or emotionally absent, learns an unsettling lesson. Connection is good, but it can vanish without warning. The safest response to that uncertainty is to stay close. Don't let the connection out of your sight. Researchers call this anxious attachment, and it doesn't disappear when childhood ends. It just changes shape. The child who once cried at daycare drop-off grows into the adult who checks their partner's phone, who feels a spike of panic when a text goes unanswered for a few hours, who fills every free evening with plans because an empty calendar feels like a threat. But attachment style is only part of the picture. There's something happening at a deeper, almost biological level. Being alone forces a person to sit with their own thoughts, and for someone carrying unresolved pain, that silence is dangerous territory. A 2014 study out of the University of Virginia tested this directly. Researchers left participants alone in a bare room for just 15 minutes with nothing to do but think, and gave them the option to press a button that delivered a mild electric shock to themselves if the silence became unbearable. Roughly 2 out of 3 people pressed it. Some pressed it more than once. 15 minutes was enough to make self-inflicted pain feel more tolerable than sitting with their own mind. That's how uncomfortable, unstructured solitude can be for a mind that has learned to associate stillness with distress. Other people become a kind of anesthesia. Conversation, noise, physical presence, all of it drowns out an internal signal that some people have spent their whole lives trying not to hear. That signal is often shame. Not sadness exactly, but a quieter, more corrosive feeling. The belief that if you were left alone with yourself for too long, you discover something unlovable underneath. So the presence of another person becomes proof against that fear. If someone is here with me, I must be worth staying for. The relationship stops being about connection and starts being about evidence. And evidence has to be renewed constantly, which is why people with this pattern often move from partner to partner with almost no gap in between, why they overcommit to friendships, why they say yes to invitations they don't even want, just to avoid the blank space of a Friday night with nothing and no one. This pattern doesn't stay confined to romantic life. It shows up at work, too, in ways that are easy to miss because they look like ambition instead of avoidance. Some employees volunteer for every group project, not because they enjoy collaboration, but because a solo assignment means hours of uninterrupted, unsupervised silence. They schedule back-to-back meetings, even when their calendar has open space. They eat lunch at their desk, surrounded by chatter, rather than step outside alone. And they feel a faint unease on days when the office is quiet. Career coaches sometimes praise this as strong team spirit. Underneath it, though, it can be the same mechanism at work. Filling time so there's no room left for the mind to sit still. Technology has made this avoidance easier than at any point in human history. A person no longer has to be in a room with someone else to escape solitude. A phone does the job. Estimates from behavioral researchers suggest the average person checks their phone somewhere between 90 and 150 times a day, and for people with a strong fear of being alone, that number tends to climb even higher, especially in moments of unstructured downtime. Waiting in line, sitting in a parked car, lying in bed before sleep, all of these small pockets of stillness get filled instantly with a screen. The phone doesn't even need to deliver anything meaningful. The scrolling itself is the point. It manufactures the sensation of company without requiring another actual person to be present. Claire's younger sister, Megan, is 26, and her phone tells a similar story in a different generation's handwriting. She has over 800 contacts, a group chat that never sleeps, and still describes herself as lonely more nights than not. She's not unusual. Surveys on loneliness in the past decade have repeatedly found that younger adults, despite being the most digitally connected generation in history, report some of the highest rates of chronic loneliness, with some studies estimating that close to half of adults under 30 feel lonely on a regular basis. Constant digital contact, it turns out, isn't the same as tolerance for solitude. For Megan, every idle moment has a ready-made escape sitting in her pocket, which means she's never once had to find out whether she could sit through the silence Claire has spent 34 years avoiding. Here's where the story gets more complicated, because this need doesn't just affect the person carrying it, it reshapes every relationship they're in. Partners often describe the early stages as intoxicating. Someone who wants to see you constantly, who texts first thing in the morning, who plans every weekend around you, feels flattering at first. It feels like being chosen. But over months, that intensity starts to look different. It starts to look like dependency. The person who can't be alone often can't tolerate their partner being alone either, at least not for long. Independence starts to register as rejection. A partner wanting a quiet solo evening can trigger genuine anxiety, not because anything is wrong, but because the absence itself feels unbearable. Therapists who work with couples see this dynamic constantly, and they've given it a less clinical, more accurate description, using another person as a life raft instead of a companion. A companion travels beside you. A life raft is something you cling to because you're convinced you'll drown without it. Relationships built on that second model tend to become exhausting for the person being clung to, and unsatisfying for the person doing the clinging, because no amount of togetherness ever actually resolves the underlying fear. It only postpones it, and postponing it comes at a cost. Research on solitude has produced a finding that surprises most people. Time alone, when it's chosen rather than forced, is strongly linked to emotional regulation, creativity, and even long-term relationship satisfaction. People who can comfortably spend time by themselves tend to know themselves better. They can identify what they actually want instead of just seeking whoever is available. They enter relationships from a place of preference rather than desperation. The irony is sharp. The very thing that feels like the antidote to loneliness, constant company, often produces a shallower, more fragile version of connection than the solitude it's designed to avoid. So what breaks the pattern? Psychologists generally point to one uncomfortable but necessary step. Small, deliberate doses of solitude, faced without distraction. Not punishing isolation, but short stretches of time spent doing nothing except sitting with your own mind. A walk without a phone, an evening without background noise. The goal isn't to enjoy it immediately. Almost no one does at first. The goal is to prove to your own nervous system that the discomfort passes, that being alone with your thoughts doesn't actually destroy you, that the silence you've spent your whole life running from was never as dangerous as it felt. Claire eventually tried exactly that. One night, between relationships, with no plans and no one to call, she sat in her apartment and let the silence stay instead of filling it. She has said that the first 20 minutes were some of the most uncomfortable of her life. And then, slowly, something shifted. The silence didn't swallow her. It just sat there, ordinary and quiet, and she was still herself inside it. That, in the end, is what solitude teaches the people brave enough to face it. Being alone was never really the danger. The danger was believing you couldn't survive it. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for sticking around till the very last second.